There's something strange about the road, something wrong. Maybe it's the way the headlights struggle to cut through the rain, or the way the trees seem too tall, too twisted, like they're watching. Maybe it's the silence inside the car, the kind that presses against your chest, making it harder to breathe. But then, there's her, standing alone, drenched, waiting. And when she lifts her head, you realize this road was never meant to be traveled. And now it's too late to turn back. Buckle up. This is a journey you won't forget.
The rain hit the glass hard and fast, making the road ahead look like a ghostly smudge of darkness and flickering headlight. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tighter. The dim light from the dashboard made his fingers look pale. Marina sat next to him with her arms crossed and looked at the wipers as they worked hard to clear the water off the windshield. It seemed like the night would never end, and the road was like a winding void that went on forever. They weren't planning to go this way. They thought it would be a quick way to cut down on the time it took to drive through the empty farmland. When they saw the small, cracked road going off to the right, they thought it would be a great alternative to the busy highway. There are no lamps or signs, just an old, forgotten road that winds through the dark, quiet woods. Even though it felt lonely, they thought it was worth the risk. There was a lot of silence between them. As the tires hissed against the wet concrete, the rain roared outside, but the air inside the car was thick with smog. Marina moved in an uncomfortable way. She didn't like taking back roads, especially at night. Something wasn't right about them. It was like the world outside the car had disappeared into the darkness. After that, they saw her. A single person standing by the side of the road, completely soaked. The rain had stuck her dress to her skin, making it stick to her unusually thin body. It looked like her arms were just hanging by her sides, and her head was bent slightly forward. Her face was hidden by a waterfall of wet, tangled hair. Lucas's foot was on the brake for a moment. "Did you see that?" Marina said in a whisper. He had, of course. But there was something about the woman that told him to keep going. There was no movement, and there was no sign that she could tell they were coming. In spite of this, as soon as his headlights hit her, he felt a cold prickle run down his spine. Then she put her head up. His breath shook. Her eyes. There were two sickly yellow glowing orbs that burned like coals in the empty spaces in her face. Something deep inside them made him feel small and prey-like they were hungry for food. His view changed. This couldn't have gone on for so long until Marina grabbed his arm. "Lucas, drive." He opened his eyes. She was gone. The road was empty again, but the area she had been in felt heavy, like it had something in it that she couldn't see. As he stepped on the gas, his heart beat very fast, and the car jerked forward through the storm. The radio then cracked. A sudden burst of static electricity filled the car. It screamed through the heavy rain. Even though Lucas turned the dial, the noise got louder. There were whispers hidden in the static. The lights flickered and the engine coughed. All of a sudden, the air inside the car became very cold. Marina shook her head. And Lucas, "I don't feel good." He also didn't. It wasn't usually cold. It got under his skin and wrapped around his ribs. It looked like they had just stepped into a freezer because his breath came out in thin white puffs. The first whisper then came, not from the news, from inside the car. Even though it was very faint, just a breath against the back of his neck, it gave him a terrible chill. For a split second, he looked in the rear-view mirror. At this moment, I have to ask, what would you do? Imagine you're driving on a dark road in the middle of a storm, and suddenly, you hear a whisper from the back seat. Would you dare to look? Or would you keep your eyes forward, hoping it's just your mind playing tricks on you? Let me know in the comments below. Because who knows? Maybe some roads are meant to be traveled blind. His heart stopped. Marina put her hand to her mouth and tried not to scream. There was the woman, being in the back seat. She was drenched and had her head bowed, her fingers lightly resting on her knee. The air around her sparkled, like how heat can change in the middle of winter. He pulled the wheel to the right. The tires skidded, and water shot up as the car swerved dangerously close to the edge of the road before it stopped. His chest shook. He was short of breath. He had no ideas. Marina touched his arm with a hand that was shaking. "Don't look at her." He got a better hold on the wheel. There was a storm on the road ahead, but it didn't matter how fast he drove or how many turns he made, something was wrong. The same signs kept coming up. The same trees, the same part of the road. Lucas took a quick look at the GPS one more time. The blue line wound around and around, turning back on itself over and over. A circle. No. He said, no, no, no. They kept going around and around until they got to the same spot, turning 66 kilometers. They couldn't leave because of the road. She was still there. A soft whisper, as smooth as silk and wet as the rain on her hair, moved through the air. Hello to me. Marin's nails went through her hand. The words had a sneaky way of getting under her skin and telling her to do what they said. Her throat got tight. Don't listen, Lucas. Too fast, though, and his hands were shaking. He increased the speed and the engine groaned as the car shook. The windshield wipers made streaks of rain on the glass, making the outside world look like a bad dream. He should have known better, he knew. But fear changes the mind in strange ways. He made the mistake in a single weak moment, in the space of one breath. Luke looked. They were sucked up by the night. The rain hit the glass hard and fast, making the world look like a blur of dark spots and flashing headlight. Lucas had his hands on the driving wheel so firmly that they turned white. Marina sat stiffly next to him, her arms around herself and her eyes fixed on the road that went on and on in front of them. The windshield wipers worked hard, but the heavy rain made the water spread out on the glass instead of getting rid of it. These were not the plans they had for this road. They couldn't stand how slowly their trip was going because the highway was jammed with cars. Since Lucas saw the small side road going through the bush, he thought it would be easy to save time. There were no lights or signs, just broken sidewalk that stretched off into the storm. They both stopped talking now. They could feel the weight of the quiet inside the car, which was worse than the rain outside. Marina moved in her seat, feeling uneasy. She had never liked driving on roads that were empty at night. Something was off about them. It was like the world outside the car didn't exist. After that, they saw her. Wet to the bone, a single figure stood on the side of the road. The storm had stuck her dress to her body, making her uncomfortably thin frame look even thinner. Her arms were loosely at her side, and her head was bowed down so that her wet hair covered her face. Lucas's foot was on the brake for a moment. "Did you see that?" Marina said in a whisper. He had, of course, but he knew deep down that he shouldn't stop. The woman didn't move, shiver, or do anything else when the car got closer. But as soon as the headlights hit her, Lucas felt something tighten in his chest. She then raised her head. He could see her eyes. A pale yellow light that shines in the dark like coal. Something deep and hungry came from them and made his whole body stiffen up. His heart beat shakily. His thoughts were all over the place. She then grabbed his arm. "Lucas, drive." He opened his eyes. She was gone. The road ahead was once more empty, but the air in the car didn't feel right. Stronger. Charge. He took short, quick breath. He felt a chill go up his back and into his bone. The radio then cracked. A short, sharp burst of static electricity filled the car. It got louder no matter what Lucas did to the dial. The rain, the engine, everything. Something else spoke through the chatter. The machine made noise. The headlights were flickering. It got cold. Not the kind that the storm brought. This was different. This didn't make sense. The car got very cold, and their breath could be seen misting the air. Marina was cold. And Lucas, "I don't feel good." He also didn't. The whisper then came. Not from the nude. From inside the car. Soft, wet, not far enough. He felt a breath on the back of his neck. Lucas quickly looked in the rearview mirror. His heart stopped. Marin put her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. There was the woman, being in the back seat. Her dress was still wet, and she had her head tilted forward and her fingers lightly on her knee. It looked like heat and cold were fighting for control of the air around her because it shimmered and warped. Lucas's body shook with fear. His whole body was telling him not to look as his fingers clenched around the wheel. Marina's hold on his arm got stronger. "Don't pay attention to her." As he pulled his eyes away, the car swerved all over the place, its tires grinding against the wet road. It didn't matter, though, because they were not going to leave. It seemed like the road would never end, but something was wrong. At every turn and bend, they were not moving forward. They were making a loop. He looked at the GPS for a moment. The bright blue line wound around into a perfect circle to show that they were going back to the same spot, turning 66 kilometers. Once more, once more, once more. He said, "No, in a whisper that was hard to hear. No, no, no. The whispering began once more, soft, not consistent. Look at me. He could feel the words in his ears and in his mind. They went deep. Marina took a deep breath. She squeezed her fists so tight that her nails hurt her hand. Lucas had a hard time holding on to the wheel. He breathed in and out in rough gasps. The order pushed him, digging into his mind and overpowering reason. Look at me. He should have known better. He knew. But fear changes the mind in strange ways. And in one weak moment, in the space of one breath, Luke looked. His eyes got bigger. He had sore hands from holding the wheel. Marina yelled out. She lunged at him and grabbed his face, pulling his eyes away before it was too late. The car went sharply to the right and skidded across the wet road. The woman spoke again in a whisper. You already know what to do. Marin's nails went through her hand. Not at all. She wouldn't pay attention. But now the voice was inside, going through her memories and fears like a snake in her head. It knew her. Lucas shook next to her. His body was shaking, and his breathing was all over the place. It got colder inside the car, and the pressure became too much to bear. Marina quickly looked at the dashboard. The gas gauge shook. The speedometer needle moved around and hung too high. The windshield wipers moved in a jerky way, leaving wet spots on the glass. Think. She then saw it. Word. A real one. It was hard to read because of the wind. The letters were faded, but one word stood out. A motel. Off-putting. Possible. Lucas. She let out a gasp. Go right. He did not respond. His eyes were glassy and his hands were twitching pointlessly on the wheel. It was Marina who took the wheel. The car jerked abruptly onto the narrow dirt road, where the tires stuck in the mud. The front lights caught a glimpse of a building up ahead. An inn. Everything changed when they turned off the main road. The radio stopped playing. There were no more whispers. The cold went away. Lucas gasped and his chest shook. His fingers flexed as if he were waking up from being paralyzed. Marina turned around with a racing heart. The back seat was not occupied. She let out a shaky breath. The bad dream was over. Or at least, she really did want to believe that. The weak flickering of the LED motel sign in the rain gave the parking lot a sickly glow. The house was very old and cracked around the edges. It was real, though. The engine was running when Lucas pulled in. They both didn't move. They both kept quiet, because they both knew in their heart it wasn't over yet. Not yet. A weak buzzing sound came from the neon sign, which cast flickering red light across the wet sidewalk. The hotel stood out in front of them. It was a small, empty building by the side of this bad road. Its paint had been worn off for a long time and was coming off the damp walls in thick, curled strips. A rusty truck sitting near the far end of the parking lot was the only thing there. Its windows were dark and empty. Even though Lucas put the car in park, he held onto the wheel like it was live. His chest went up and down as he breathed. It was too quiet in the car to breathe. They both didn't say anything because they were afraid to break the fragile silence. She looked in the rear-view mirror. Not full. Her throat got tight. She should have felt safer after that. It wasn't. There was still some weight in the air after they left the main road, but something had changed. It stuck around, like a bad taste from the past. It was still there, like a ghost that she couldn't see but could feel pushing at the edges of her awareness. Then she looked at Lucas. His skin was cold and pale. He hadn't moved since the car stopped. He was looking at nothing with his eye. She said in a whisper, "Lucas." Not an answer. As she reached for him, her hand was shaking. When her fingers touched his arm, he jerked suddenly and took a sharp breath in, as if he were waking up from a bad dream. He looked at her with wild, stray eyes. He swallowed hard, and his Adam's apple moved around. Did I see her? Marina was unsure. She didn't want to talk. They didn't want to face the truth because it was so bad. She finally said, "You did, but I stopped you." Lucas let out a weak breath, leaned back against the seat, and ran his hands down his face. His fingers were shaking against his skin. It felt like his voice got weak. It felt like something was in my head, bringing me closer to her. Marina said, "Yes." Lucas, she was in the car. He became stiff, and all of his muscles locked into place. She said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. I saw her. She was sitting right there. She looked back to the back seat again, as if she thought she would see a wet, dead body there. But it stayed empty. Lucas closed his eyes and pressed his hands against his temple. Are we really safe? She looked at the motel from the window. In the window, there was a dim glow from a vacancy sign. The door to the hallway was slightly open and swaying in the wind. It looked like no one had been there in years. She said, I don't know. They couldn't stay in the car, though. Lucas let out a sigh and finally took off his seatbelt. Let's just get a room. Take a break inside. Figure out what the hell is going on. Marina was unsure. She was scared at the thought of going inside that building. It wasn't just that the hotel looked like it had been abandoned. They had the feeling they were walking into something worse. But she didn't have a point. It wasn't possible to stay in the car. She said yes. All right. They all opened the doors at the same time. As soon as their feet hit the ground, the rain got worse and hit the car roof, the road, and their skin like drum. As Marina hurried toward the lobby door, cold drops ran down the backs of her arms and soaked her sleeve. Lucas was the first to walk in. His shoes squelched against the worn-out floor right outside the door. Marina followed, and her body was shaking from the cold and the unease in her stomach. The motel's inside was worse than its outside in some way. You could smell mildew and a slight metallic smell in the thick air. A dim light above shook back and forth, creating shaky shadows on the peeling wallpaper. An old bar with a tarnished bell sitting on top of it stood against the back wall. It was next to an open logbook whose pages were curled from being wet. There was no one there. Marina looked wary at Lucas as she rubbed her arms together. Is this place open at all? Lucas leaned over the bar and looked into the empty space behind the desk. Hello. His voice echoed a little in the empty room. Nothing. He rang the bell. It was loud and sharp, like a bell, in the middle of the quiet. Still nothing. Then there was a sound coming from deep inside the room. A moving around, slow and careful. Whose steps? Marina tensed up and her breath caught. The sound got closer. It came from the hallway beyond the bar and moved slowly, like it was dragging. He took a step back. Someone is coming. The air changed in the room. The temperature went down. In the hall, a door opened with a squeak. Then they saw him. From the darkness came a man, if that's still the right word for him. He stepped into the dim light. His clothes were dirty, and his rental uniform was faded and wrinkly, like he hadn't washed it in years. His skin was pale and stretched too tight over his bone, making his face look drawn. His eyes, on the other hand, made Marina's blood freeze, since they were yellow. Not the same as the woman. Not shining, not hungry, but wrong, not natural, and fixed his eyes on Lucas as if he knew him. The man's mouth turned into a shape that looked a lot like a smile. You ought to have stayed on the road. Marina felt sick to her stomach. Lucas clenched his teeth. What? The man didn't turn around, not moving. His back was straight and stiff, like something was holding up a hollow body. You were meant to stay on the road. As if to warn, the words coiled in the air. Marissa could feel her heart beating hard against her ribs. The cold was coming back in, giving them the same numbed feeling they had in the car. Lucas moved his fingers next to his body. Where is this? She asked with a voice that wasn't steady. The man turned his head a little, as if he were thinking about what to say. After that, he took one step forward. Lucas grabbed Marina by the wrist and naturally pulled her back. The man's mouth moved once more. It makes her sad when people leave. Marina's skin turned scaly. The lights went on and off, and somewhere, still far away but getting closer, the whisper came back. Look at me. Marina took a deep breath. Not at all. No, no, no. Lucas turned around and pulled her toward the car. We're leaving. The parking lot wasn't the same when they came back through the door, though. You could still stay at the hotel. But the road. There was no road, and in its place, going on forever into the darkness. The forest. The trees were too tall to be real, and their twisted branches looked terrible against the stormy sky. The rain had slowed down to a light drizzle, but the air was still thick and heavy with something that couldn't be seen. The hotel behind them stayed the same, with its weakly flickering neon Avanci sign. But the road. There was no road. The forest grew forever in its place, taking up the whole area area where the road used to be. There were no markers, signs, or other signs that a road had ever been there. There was only the wet ground, the thick trees, and the suffocating silence of something watching. Lucas stood still, and his breath came out in short, ragged gasps. Marina grabbed his arm and dug her fingers into his sleeve. She said in a whisper, "This isn't real." He turned toward the car, but his stomach felt sick. There was no car there. The parking lot had no cars in it. Gone. It was all gone. A low, humming pulse of static electricity went through the air, making their bones shake. Marina jerked, and her ears started to ring. Lucas quickly turned around and looked around, but there was nothing there. Nothing moving. There is no wind. Getting ready. The whisper then came. "Look at me." A slow, sneaky breath coming into their ears. She clenched her teeth and shook her head. No. Lucas's hold on her hand got stronger. He was shaking. The door to the hotel opened and shut behind them. "Take your time." Thoughtful. Marina didn't change. No, she wouldn't. Lucas took a sharp breath next to her. His body got stiff. She begged, "Don't." She knew, though. He looked. The air around them broke apart and rushed inward like a whole, taking in the sound, the light, and even the space itself. Marina let out a gasp as the weight squished her chest and made it hard for her to breathe. It was even colder than before, and the cold sank into her bones and made her fingers, lips, and thoughts feel numb. The whispering got stronger. Add more views. A group of creepy, wet whispers. "Look at me. Look at me. Look at me." Marina tried to grab Lucas, but he was moving away. Lucas's eyes were wide, and he let out a quiet gasp. And everything turned black. The next morning, the car was found, left behind. The chairs were wet from the rain, and the doors were left open. The radio wasn't working and the engine was cold. There were no signs of a fight. There are no tracks going into the trees. There was only an empty car, and something was left behind. It was written in a thin layer of dust that had settled overnight on the rearview mirror. It was just one word. "Thank you." It was written by someone or something that no one knew. There was no sign of Lucas or Marina, and the road stayed. A cursed stretch of lost asphalt that winds through endless forests and doesn't go anywhere. Travelers have heard the whisper late at night, when it's raining hard and the air is cold. There was a voice that cut through the chatter and sounded like a breath from something they couldn't see. "Look at me." Some people do. They aren't seen again after that. So if you ever end up on that road, don't look at yourself. Don't stop the car. Also, if someone says to you, "Run." Some souls never leave the road, and some victims never escape it. But this isn't the only story of eerie encounter. In the next video, a driver picks up a lost woman on the highway, only to realize too late that she was never supposed to be there. Click now, before she asks you for a ride too.